Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey Shane. I'm the Marketing Director at the Canadian Digestive Health Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this evening on medical cannabis versus recreational cannabis, Why Medical? This webinar has been made possible through an unrestricted educational grant from Spectrum Therapeutics. For those who don't know CDHF, we are the official foundation of the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology, which means we are directly connected to Canada's leading digestive health experts, physicians, scientists, and other healthcare professionals. So you can trust us to provide you with practical, science-based information that is up-to-date and unbiased. Just a note, this is the first webinar in our 3-part webinar series that will be taking place over the next few weeks. So if you haven't already, be sure to register for the other medical cannabis webinars that we have. The next one will highlight the evidence to date on May 30th, and the third we will hear from 3 different patients who have used medical cannabis for various conditions, and that one will be on June 13th. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Christopher Schneider. Dr. Schneider is the Assistant Professor of Gastroenterology at the University of Manitoba. His practice mostly involves the treatment of patients with IBS, Crohn's, colitis, and liver disease. And he has been one of the major voices advocating for an evidence-based approach to cannabis therapies. Just a few housekeeping notes before we start. This is a live presentation. During it, if any questions come to mind, please enter your questions in the question box at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. If you do not see the form, click the Ask a Question hand icon in the top right of the screen. And if you need any technical support, you can click on the Help button, and someone will be standing by to help you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Schneider.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. So this webinar is basically done to help navigate the important question we have in Canada of what type of cannabis direction should we use? Should we go for the recreational and buy it at a dispensary or online through things such as the Ontario Cannabis Store, or should we see our medical doctor and go through the medical process for it? I just want to make sure everyone's on the same slide. So is Kelsey, could you tell me, are we on the what to choose, medical versus recreational cannabis slide? Slide number 6.
Yes, we are.
Yes? Okay, perfect. And then it's just switched over right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, good. I just want to make sure my controls are working.
No problem.
So there are a bunch of different things you can do to sort of, this webinar will give you a bunch of different sort of techniques to help you identify what type of cannabis user you are, and what are the different components and differences to help you decide which direction you want to go in. So one of the first questions I think is important to ask is if you are considering using cannabis for either recreational purposes or for as a medical patient, so I think it's important to identify what type of cannabis you are. So there's so we basically divided people into 3 sort of main categories. There's the cannabis connoisseur, the first-time user, and the medical patient. So to talk a little bit more about the different types of users, the cannabis connoisseur is often somebody who's used cannabis for a long time. They're typically very knowledgeable about the different types of cannabis, even how to different ways to grow cannabis and the different uses and methods of extraction. I find these people are very, very interesting. They're very generous with their time, and they can talk about cannabis at length, and know definitely more than probably most medical doctors and people working in the healthcare field about use of cannabis. Many of these people, although we typically think of people who use cannabis every day as people who are not high achievers, but many of these people, in fact, are very highly functional people who hold corporate jobs, have families, but they use cannabis to help them and to deal with whatever, just to relax or whatever issue that they're dealing with. The other type is on the other extreme, the first-time user. These are people who have never used cannabis before, but mostly through interaction with other cannabis users, they become interested in cannabis. They're often very apprehensive to try cannabis, and before even taking their first try of cannabis, they require an extensive understanding of the plant, its effect on the human body, and any potential side effects. They also would need coaching on how to use cannabis and the different delivery systems available. Finally, is the medical patient. This is someone who's been diagnosed with a medical condition, and in which this medical condition there's support for the use of cannabis therapy. They've typically tried multiple other medical treatments with limited success, and their main goal in using cannabis is they just want to feel better, and they want to get better from their medical illness. There's typically these patients are more interested in CBD predominant strains delivered in the plant in oil or a capsule. So a little bit more about the difference between recreational and medical cannabis. Both recreational and medical cannabis in Canada is produced is entirely by licensed producers. These are people registered with Health Canada. And currently, as of when this webinar was put together on May 13, 2017, there are 177 licensed producers registered with Health Canada. Some of these licensed producers only sell to medical patients, and some of these licensed producers only focus on manufacturing of oils and the development of delivery systems. So they're not necessarily all cultivators. All of these, both medical and recreational cannabis, go through quite extensive testing. Currently, there are 58 labs that are registered and licensed with Health Canada to test medicinal cannabis. And funnily enough, they call these labs a licensed dealer. I don't know why they use that term, but kind of a funny term for a lab testing facility for cannabis. And what these lab testing facilities do is they test the CBD and THC component and dose it in milligrams. They also do microbial testing. They test for yeast and mold, which is called the TMY ratio. They test for alpha toxins, which typically are produced by a fungus called Aspergillus. They also check for bacteria that could make us sick, such as E. coli, Salmonella, Pseudomonas, and MRSA. Heavy metal testing is done. 4 main metals are arsenic, lead, cadmium, and one other I can't remember at this point. They also test for pesticides. There's a minimum of 20 pesticides that need to be tested, but some labs will test up to 96 different pesticides on cannabis. Those are the basic ones. The other two that some more advanced labs will do is they'll do a terpene profile to help further identify the type of cannabis, and they'll also test for more advanced cannabinoids, because the CBD and THC are only 2 of more than 100 cannabinoids that have been identified in the plant. And the most common ones that are tested beyond CBD and THC is CBN, CBG, and CBC. So recreational cannabis is available to anyone above 19 years or older across Canada, except for Alberta and Quebec, which the legal age for purchase of recreational cannabis is 18 years old. There is here in the cannabis industry, there's a movement to replace recreational cannabis with adult use cannabis, so just basically changing the name. As they don't feel recreational, it sort of trivializes cannabis. It doesn't really, it doesn't really say that this should be used more exclusively in adults. So there's a movement so maybe in the next few years we'll see recreational cannabis replaced with recreational cannabis. Recreational cannabis will be replaced with adult use cannabis. So it'd be the difference. This webinar would be the difference between adult use cannabis and medical cannabis. Adults, like I was saying before, they can buy either from a licensed dispensary or they can buy online from a government-run store. Adults can buy up to 30 grams at a time. Also, I think it's important to make a note and talk a little bit about the unregulated cannabis industry. So this is cannabis not produced by a licensed producer registered with Health Canada. And, this whole webinar, we're going to be talking about medical versus recreational cannabis. However, unregulated cannabis is by far the most consumed type of cannabis across Canada. It currently is estimated to account for 71% of cannabis consumption in Canada. And currently, the unregulated market is thriving under the Legalized Cannabis Act. There's many reasons for it, which we'll talk about that throughout the webinar. But some of the reasons, just right off the bat, is that people talk about it. They talk about their relationship with their dealer. It's someone that they've worked with and purchased from over many years. They find that the dealer often gives them a high quality product. And some people in the cannabis industry say, well, getting unregulated cannabis is like buying moonshine instead of a fine wine. However, I don't think that's totally true. Moonshine only comes in one flavor, which is similar to vodka. And you can't get a brandy or a cognac from a shiner. However, someone selling unregulated cannabis can give you every different type and strain, and even including oils and extracts. So it does give the variety that you would see if someone was somehow producing illegal alcohol with different types and different flavors. They often talk about the service that they get from the unregulated cannabis dealer, which often involves delivery. There's been no shortages of supply, and it's typically cheaper than dispensary cannabis. Stats Canada in December 2018 put out a report, and they said typically unregulated cannabis sells for $6.51 a gram, whereas the dispensary cannabis sells for $9.70 a gram. The other pro that some people like is there's no traceability, which we'll talk about some of the concerns of people having a credit card statement that says cannabis when crossing the U.S. border or going to get a job. So this is a sort of a cash-only business. The cons is obviously there's no testing or quality assurance. There is a potential that it could be, and there are reports of the cannabis being contaminated with other drugs. There's no complaints process. There's less accountability, and there's with any unregulated industry, and there's you could be dealing with some people who are less ethical. But even in the regulated industry, there could be unethical people there too. So I wrote dealing with criminals, put it in quotes, whether people consider that a crime or not. Medicinal cannabis is run through the medical doctor's office. So it's a patient that's diagnosed with a medical condition by a medical doctor, and the doctor sets a prescribed amount of cannabis. Other parameters can be set by the doctor, the type of strain, to the ratio of CBD to THC, and if it's an oil or dried leaf. There's no age requirement, meaning that children could get access to medicinal cannabis if it was appropriate and prescribed by the doctor. And there's no limit on the amount of cannabis. So unlike the 30 grams a day that is involved with recreational cannabis in the regulated industry, in medicinal cannabis, it's based on the patient's needs. So it could be more or less. Just to give you a little bit of perception to the background stuff that's done in the medicinal cannabis sector. So if there is a decision to move forward with the medicinal cannabis for a patient, there is a medical document that's filled out. So they like to talk about the prescription for medicinal cannabis, but it's actually not a prescribed drug. It doesn't have a drug identification number. Health Canada has not deemed it as specific medication, so it's more of an authorization form to permit the patient to purchase medicinal cannabis. And the forms vary in length and complexity. At first, they're quite tedious, and you send the form in, it would get sent back. There was many corrections that were needed. Things got a little bit simpler, but this is sort of a basic medical document that at least the first page of it, that the medical doctor would fill out. It's important to have all the patient demographics and contact information. Diagnosis is needed. the amount of cannabis per day, so a certain amount of dose per day, the duration of therapy, and any parameters or restrictions that are needed. And those need to be all filled out. Then after the medical document is done, it's faxed to a licensed producer. The licensed producer verifies the medical doctor or clinic's credentials, especially if it's the first medical authorization that they get. And they'll typically, for the first few, they'll verify the dose and the patient demographics directly with the doctor. Then the licensed producer contacts the patient. An online counseling session is set up. And then the licensed producer gives online access through their ordering portal to the patient, and only the products that are authorized by authorized on the medical document are visible to the patient. So if it's a CBD only strain, only those products will be visible to the patient, nothing else. It'll be so any THC containing high THC ratios will not be visible, so it won't even be a potential selection for the patient. The patient will then order the products they want and pay the LP directly through their ordering portal. And then Canada Post will deliver the product from the licensed producer straight to the patient's address. So it's kind of a different system. There's no other medication where the patient, contacts, for example, Pfizer to buy an antihypertensive medication directly from the drug company. So this is a direct interaction with the producer of cannabis. So many people are concerned about talking about cannabis with their doctor. That many of us have developed long-term relationships with our therapeutic relationships with our family doctor, and we don't want to lose that. And they're worried about if they start bringing up cannabis therapy, what will be the response? Will this affect the relationship, or if they'll be judged in a negative way? So just to give you sort of a perception of the medical community, so it's estimated about 10% of physicians prescribe cannabis. There's been studies where it's shown it's actually smaller. There was some study done by the college in Alberta that estimated that showed that only 4% of only 4% of physicians were actually created an authorization, but that number is believed to have grown to about 10%. So still 9 out of 10 times, the physician will have not completed a medical authorization for cannabis in the past, but 1 out of 10 have. Most Canadian physicians are open to medicinal cannabis, so that there may not be a negative reaction from the physician. But there's many reasons why the physician has not yet prescribed cannabis. Many of them are unsure of the dosing and the method of use. It's quite confusing for them, and it's not something that any of us have learned in medical school. Many of them don't know how to fill out the medical authorization form, and especially for GPs, there are so many forms that they have to fill out every day. So to have to figure out a new form, go back and forth multiple times, is just something that's quite time-consuming, and they're interested in potentially having someone else fill out this form, which I'll talk about in a little bit, than filling it out themselves. It's also a concern about a relationship with a licensed producer. So if you notice, the physician's office has to fax the form to the licensed producer. So that means that you have to have direct contact with the drug company. And there's lots of stigma, by patients and physicians about dealing directly with the drug company. So why did you, there's 177 licensed producers, why you, Dr. X, did you choose this licensed producer in particular? So they worry about sort of the perception and the perceived ethics of it. Also, there's a worry about interactions with other medications. It's not a highly researched area yet. There is still, many studies that talk about interactions with different medications and how cannabis interacts with those medications. However, it is something that is less clear and less defined. And then the main reason, I think, is the stigma from their colleagues and from potentially the general community. Someone could be quite upset, if you prescribed their daughter medicinal cannabis, and especially in smaller communities, that some physicians will be apprehensive about that. So really, in the medical community, the sort of the guidelines that can give you in sort of trying to select what doctor to speak to about medicinal cannabis is the ones that would be more resistant to medicinal cannabis are sort of are part of the what's called the establishment, or where they call themselves the academic physicians, which is kind of silly because all of us have done many years of education, versus the community physicians. So the physicians that are working in the universities and sort of the ivory tower type medicine what I'm finding are the physicians that are less likely to endorse cannabis and to be knowledgeable of cannabis. However, the GPs or the community specialists that are working outside of those hospitals that are seeing many more patients a day and being asked this question many more times, they are the ones that seem to be more open to cannabis and willing to give that a try with patients. And they just sort of see the need, and they've been asked many more times, and they've had to address it. So that could help you. The other thing is there are multiple cannabis clinics across the country, and they can be a great resource because there's typically a community physician there that is experienced in medicinal cannabis. They have nurses and cannabis educators working there. They have access to all the licensed producers across Canada, so they can help the patient choose the licensed producer that's best for them, and they also have lots of education for the patients. So to help you decide further recreational versus medicinal cannabis, I've created sort of different categories with differentials where recreational and medical cannabis are differentiated, and to sort of help you decide which one is the best for you. So the first one is needs and education. So you just sort of like when you're identifying what type of cannabis user you are, these are some questions that you could ask yourself more specifically to help identify that. Starting off, I think it's important to ask, why do you think cannabis is right for you? What do you already know about cannabis, and how long do you think you'll need to use cannabis? In the medicinal cannabis side, there's quite a large amount of education, and I'll just go through the different roles that the different members of the care team would be talking to you about. So the physician's main role is to establish a care plan. So if it's for pain management, there are many different medications, many different approaches. So if cannabis is part of it, that would be part of the care plan, among other things for pain management. And the physician will use an evidence-based method. So they'll be using studies to help support the use of the certain medications that they're using. They will decide the dose, the delivery mechanism, and any restrictions that are needed. So there's perhaps a little less control on the patient side, but these are always, they should be always discussed with the patient, and the care plan can be established in a collaborative way. Medication interactions will be assessed, and with the physician, because they have access to many different medications, including opioids, alternatives can be offered. If the physician's working at a cannabis clinic, the nurse educator or the cannabis educator would talk to the patient about the different methods of use, care of the delivery mechanisms, so how to care for a vaporizer, for example, different storage regulations, and be able to support the patient throughout their journey with cannabis. There would be a follow-up plan made with ongoing monitoring. Furthermore, on the medicinal cannabis side, the licensed producer they typically assign the patient a cannabis educator, or just there's a general line for the patient to talk to a cannabis educator. And these people are product specialists, so they know the product inside and out that the licensed producer is producing for the medicinal cannabis patients. They're able to answer the patient's questions and offer them support throughout their ordering process and even for use. On the recreational side, there's less education. The people that work at the cannabis the dispensaries, called bud tenders, they are not allowed to give medical advice or recommend a specific product or dosage. They're not medical professionals, therefore they're not allowed. And people tell me that they asked for those things and they didn't get any advice when they were asking for recommendations. The budtenders can say things though, like if someone's coming for a sleep problem, they could say, I know other people with insomnia have bought this product in the past, or if they're users of cannabis, they can say, I use this for sleep. So they can sort of indirectly help guide patients, but they can't give specific recommendations. There's no educator assigned from the LP. However, buying recreational cannabis can be a very fast and convenient and anonymous way, especially if cash is used to access cannabis and don't have to go through the whole medical process. Next section I'd like to talk about is the supply and selection. So recreational cannabis, unfortunately, has had chronic shortages in the dispensaries mostly this was blamed on this excess government regulation. So too many rules placed on the licensed producers and dispensaries in terms of labeling, transport, and taxing that have made it that there's been a chronic issue of shortages ever since cannabis legalization started on October 17, 2018 in Canada. So typically, your selection is reduced to you get what you see. So some of this very, very basic products that are available. In the recreational side, there are CBD strains available. However, most strains that are carried by the dispensaries are THC focused, more for the getting high rather than for a medical use. And the medical supply, though, has been a bit better. There has been shortages, there's no doubt, and some LPs have had more, or it's more common that they have shortages than others. But there's been less shortages due to the fact that the LPs have been prioritizing medical therapy as cannabis because they know people need this as their medicine, and they don't want people to be without it. Also, I think medical patients are more consistent buyers for the licensed producers, so they definitely, even from a business side, I think it makes sense for them to be prioritizing the medicinal cannabis patients. So more crops are grown for the medical cannabis. They have reserved lots for medical only, and even some of the licensed producers have been warehousing cannabis in their medical supply to ensure that they don't have any shortages. There's a wider selection of CBD strains, and the medicinal cannabis LPs have been developing different delivery mechanisms so that mostly on the oils and the capsule side that seem to be more popular with the medicinal cannabis patients. The cost is another big factor in helping decide which cannabis to use. There's the recreational cannabis has been sort of plagued with very high cost, it's much higher cost than unregulated cannabis, and is more expensive than medicinal cannabis. This is mostly due to taxation and regulation. The federal government puts on an excise tax, which is $1 per gram, or 10% of the total sale, whichever is higher. This is paid by the licensed producer straight to CRA, and then of course that cost is passed on to the customer. There is GST or PST, HST, whichever it is in each province, which can vary between 15% in Nova Scotia to as low as 5% in Alberta. There's also extra taxes placed on recreational cannabis, such as in Manitoba, where there's a social responsibility fee attached to it. The PST has been dropped in Manitoba, though, so that sort of makes it equal, but it's still another specific cannabis tax. The recreational cannabis all comes through provincial distributors. So in Manitoba, for example, it comes through the Liquor and Gaming Commission, and they put a nice big fat markup from when they receive it to when they sell it to the dispensaries. And there are also Health Canada licensing fees for the licensed producers, which also adds to the cost and explains why recreational cannabis is so expensive. The medicinal cannabis the taxes are no different, which is actually kind of shocking for a medicine. But what makes it cheaper is the excise tax is absorbed by the LPs. They don't pass on that 10% tax to the patient because they want to make it more affordable for the patient. It's the GST though, or sales tax, is still charged to the patient. So that you add anywhere between 15 to 5% on the medicinal cannabis. Though what is different, or what is sort of special with medicinal cannabis is many of the licensed producers have compassionate pricing, where they'll give up to a 20% discount on the medicinal cannabis, and this is done through an application by the patient for compassionate pricing, and if accepted, the patient will get a 20% discount. So, medicinal cannabis right off the bat is 10% cheaper because there's no excise tax, and can be up to 30% cheaper if you add in the 20% discount you can get from compassionate pricing and the 10% discount from not having to pay the excise tax. There's no social responsibility fee, and because the medicinal cannabis is sold directly from the licensed producers straight to the patient, there's no provincial distributors involved. Therefore, there can be no distributor markup, which also helps reduce the cost. Also, other parts just to consider, both for the medicinal and recreational cannabis. So basically, any regulated cannabis, there are increased costs to pay for the testing, to pay for destruction of any rejected product from the testing. So there's special procedures needed to destroy that product. Compliance costs, so lots and lots of legal fees in terms of keeping in making sure that they remain compliant with Health Canada and all the other regulators throughout the whole process. They also have to pay taxes. So there's Canada, a corporate tax rate after the small business discount is 27%. There's employee wages and benefits to be paid. Transport costs, so that the cannabis can be it's often transferred across the country, and marketing costs. And the marketing is mostly within the dispensaries and to the medicinal cannabis prescribers. So the bottom line is recreational cannabis is the most expensive. As we saw with Stats Canada, it's typically $9.70 a gram at the end of 2018 as per their data. And unregulated cannabis still remains the cheapest. I'll show you some other stats that actually could make medicinal cannabis similar in cost to unregulated cannabis, but unregulated cannabis is definitely the cheapest. Medicinal cannabis sits in between recreational and unregulated cannabis. And the cost can be quite substantial. So I just did a little calculation here to show you what the annual cost of a regular medicinal cannabis user could be. So if they were given an authorization for 1 gram a day based on their needs, and they needed it, and they used 1 gram a day, and they were able to somehow, this is kind of a low price, but somehow get through medicinal cannabis for $8 a gram, and then they have to pay, and they lived in Ontario, and they had to pay 13% HST. So there would be the calculation would be $8 a day for $8 1 gram for 1 gram a day at $8 a gram for 365 days. Would come to $2,920 multiplied by 1.13, which is the sales tax. So the final price would come out to $3,299.60. So quite a substantial cost for one medicine. And if this is somebody who is taking multiple medications for pain or for multiple sclerosis, it can be quite a large financial burden on the patient. Insurance coverage, though, can decrease the cost. As you can imagine, recreational cannabis has no insurance coverage, but medicinal cannabis has been slowly covered by some of the insurance companies over the past years. Sun Life was the first insurer to cover medicinal cannabis, and they covered it in straight through the specific drug coverage. Which was nice. So if you're working for a company and Sun Life is the insurer, and the employer has added medicinal cannabis coverage, so it's an extra cost to the employer to add that in. It could be covered. Many other people and the other insurance companies like Manulife don't have specific coverage for cannabis, but do allow it to be billed through the health spending account, which is kind of unfortunate because the health spending account can be used for many different things, such as gym membership, glasses, all sorts of things. So it's kind of a shame that there isn't a specific medicinal cannabis category. Great West Life on March 1st, 2019. So just a little bit over 6 weeks from now, 6 weeks ago, they announced the most comprehensive cannabis coverage, where they have a paid direct drug card that will cover medicinal cannabis up to $5,000 a year. And they partnered with Shoppers Drug Mart to help with strain selection, coaching, and monitoring. So they coordinate the entire process for the patient, and the patient doesn't have to pay anything out of pocket. It's covered straight through their paid direct drug card, which is nice because in Sun Life, for example, the patient has to pay for it and then apply to get reimbursed. Veterans Affairs has been covering medicinal cannabis for many years, and they cover at a rate of $8.50 a gram, up to a maximum of 3 grams a day. So the patient chose or required a strain more expensive than $8.50 a gram, they'd be out of pocket that difference. In terms of taxes, there's no tax write-off for recreational cannabis, but if the person's gone down the medicinal cannabis pathway, they can write off the medicinal cannabis on their personal income tax. So it's the income tax that's due for all of us in Canada on April 30th of every year. This only involves the actual cannabis product, so dried beef, oils, or seeds. It doesn't. If someone's growing their own cannabis, it doesn't involve any of the hydroponics or the lights or the rooms or any other expenses that would be required to grow those cannabis plants. It's only the actual product. And so to give you just sort of an idea of what this tax write-off would look like, I took the calculation we did before of $3,299.60 of an average sort of a cannabis user using 1 gram a day over the entire year. And then took the average Canadian salary at the end of 2018, which is, according to Stats Canada, $55,000 and $806.40. And then what they do is the CRA has you calculate 3% of your income. So 3% of the income, or 3% of $55,000 is $1,600. So then what you would do is you would take the total amount of cannabis that you purchased minus 3% of your income, and then the difference would become a credit on your taxes, which a credit is the best thing. It's way better than deduction because it reduces how much tax you have to pay. So if you're living in Ontario, the federal and provincial government combined taxes on $55,000 would be $13,000. You would minus that the $1,625.41 that you calculated from the equation just in the line above. So it would reduce your tax burden to $11,000 at $393.59. So there's so basically getting this as a tax credit basically drives the medicinal cannabis to half price. So we were calculating at $8 a gram. With this tax credit, you would actually reduce it to $4 a gram, which would actually make it even cheaper than unregulated cannabis. So if you do write it off your taxes, it can be, and you are a regular user and it's worth it, it would definitely be so you have to. When I say it's worth it, you have to be able to, if you can see from this equation, you have to be able to be using more medicinal cannabis than 3% of your income. So if you are in that situation, it's definitely worth it writing it off from your taxes. Employment. So many people have concerns with employment, so do employers, of how to deal with both recreational and medicinal cannabis. So recreational cannabis is by employers, by employment law, what I've been able to find, is it's treated the same as alcohol and illicit drugs. So that typically employers have the rule of no dried leaf use 4 hours prior to work. So it's a smoker vaporized version, and no ingestible cannabis 6 hours prior to work. However, if someone's comes with a medicinal cannabis prescription, it's treated as the same as a prescription drug used for a specific disability, and they use that wording in employment law. So basically, if it's somebody who has anxiety and they need a certain medication to reduce the anxiety, this anxiety can disable or reduce the person's productivity at work. This is something that the employer, normally, should be interested in helping that employee work with the treatment to help make them a more productive worker. So there's provincial human rights legislation, though, that even if the employer was not interested, that forced the employer to attempt to accommodate the employee. However, the employer also has a responsibility to other employees and public to keep them safe. So it becomes a sort of a case-by-case basis in every medicinal cannabis patient and how they deal with their employer and their job. Impairment, one of some of the sort of the main sort of things that come out of the employment policies is impairment is not a right. So if someone wants to be high at work and this helps them with their let's say anxiety, and that's not, and they're not productive during that time, it's not a right for them to be high. However, accommodation or alternate dosing could be planned, especially in safety-sensitive jobs. So, for example, there was a Calgary. He was a grader operator in Calgary that had a medicinal cannabis prescription, and it was felt that it was a safety-sensitive job. He should not be using medicinal cannabis if he's operating a grader, which makes a lot of sense. And so he was also ultimately dismissed from his job by the city of Calgary. This, however, when the details came out, is this employee was using it for sleep, and he was using ingestible cannabis well before 6 hours before he operated any grader. So it was, there was a legal challenge by the union, public workers in Calgary, and it was deemed that this would not be a safety sensitive. It would not cause any safety issues to the public. Therefore, it was reinstated, and particular parameters were put in place to ensure that this grader operator would not be impaired on the job. Purchase and possession is another aspect where there's a difference between recreational cannabis and medicinal cannabis. There's so recreational cannabis, but like I said before, there's the maximum that anyone can purchase a single day is at 30 grams, and possession is also 30 grams to match the maximum purchase. On medicinal cannabis, the maximum is governed by the prescription. So if and typically it's a 30-day supply that people buy just to more keep it current. However, in the new legislation, someone could buy their entire year supply right from one. It would be hard to, there might be some deterioration of the products. People don't typically do that, but there's no law stopping them from doing that. So the example would be if they were authorized for 3 grams a day, and they wanted to get a 30-day supply, and they would buy 90 grams. Possession is either a 30-day supply or 150 grams, whichever is lesser, plus 30 grams of recreational cannabis. So somebody walking around who has a medicinal cannabis prescription could walk around with a maximum of 180 grams. when we're talking about possession, this is walking around either on the street or driving in your car with cannabis. There's no limits on storage, so how much cannabis you can hold in your private residence, except for a few exceptions. One of them involves Quebec, where Quebec is 150 grams, or BC, where it's 1 kilogram. But most provinces, there's no limit on storage. The other thing is there is sort of a perception between recreational and medicinal cannabis. So this is I remember when I did my Amsterdam course in April, they would talk about the instructors there would talk about the difference between if you were being prosecuted for cannabis possession and the prosecutor held up a bag of cannabis and says, "Oh, I caught this young man with this much cannabis." And in the bag it looks illicit, it looks like a drug, it looks contraband, versus I caught this young man with this many pill bottles and the person's medicine. So they're talking about how if you do have medicinal cannabis, keep it in the containers, travel with that, and the likelihood of conviction would be less, even if you were exceeding your possession limit. Use in public spaces and institutions. So smoking and vaping rules equally apply to medicinal cannabis as well as recreational cannabis. So I've heard people say before, "Oh, I have a medicinal cannabis prescription. I can smoke on the street," or in places that recreational cannabis users can't. And that's not true. It's wherever it's the same for medicinal and recreational cannabis. The one thing that's interesting is if someone is requiring hospitalization, often the oils and the capsules that the person has a medicinal cannabis prescription can be used and administered, given by the nursing. Typically, the pharmacies are not holding the cannabis, so it's the patient it supplies the cannabis and then it's distributed by the hospital. The smoking and vaping rules vary per province. And there are our Confederation of Canada, every province does their own thing. But here are some examples here in Ontario. So there's so unlike tobacco, where in Ontario no one can smoke in a vehicle with someone under 16 years old. That's the law with tobacco. However, with cannabis, you can't smoke in a vehicle. No one can smoke. Even the passengers cannot smoke in a vehicle, whether it's moving or parked. There's no smoking near children. That includes playgrounds, schools, child care centers, and a distance of 20 meters must be maintained from those areas. No smoking within 20 meters of sports fields, and no smoking of cannabis in bus shelters. So that's Ontario. However, there are some provinces where, including my province of Manitoba, where no consumption in any public space is allowed, whether it's smoked or ingested. Obviously, ingested is a little bit easier to conceal, but it's still against the law in these provinces. That includes Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, PEI, and the Territory of Yukon. Where can you consume cannabis? In your private home, on the sidewalk, and I'm talking about Ontario, so obviously not in Manitoba, but in Ontario. In designated smoking rooms at hotels or motels, or in RVs, houseboats, or yachts. But they have to be parked and anchored. So, someone would argue, say, well, an RV or a boat is a vehicle, but they designate, when it's designated an RV or a houseboat is when it has a kitchen and a bathroom. And if it has those two features, then when it's parked or anchored, cannabis can be consumed in Ontario. Growing at home, so many people who are especially the cannabis connoisseurs will attempt to or be interested in growing at home. So most provinces allow up to 4 plants for personal use. This is adult use, recreational cannabis. 4 plants can be grown, with the exception of Manitoba, where recreational cannabis cannot be grown. However, medicinal cannabis can grow, and Quebec, where both recreational and medicinal cannabis cannot be grown as per Quebec law in someone's home. So the medicinal cannabis, though, is there's no limits on how many plants someone could grow. It's based on their needs, and it's based on how many grams per day is prescribed by the physician. There's a calculator on the Health Canada website that helps people determine how many plants that they can grow. So, for example, I went put these numbers through the calculator for you guys, but if you're prescribed 1 gram per day, you can have up to 5 indoor plants or 2 outdoor plants. The reason less for outdoor is typically outdoor plants produce higher yields, obviously not in the wintertime in Canada, or 3 grams per day, where you can have up to 15 plants indoors or 6 plants outdoors. You must be over 18 years old to be authorized as a grower. So the way you get authorization from Health Canada to become a grower is you take your medicinal cannabis prescription, and then you download the application to grow at home, and then you submit both forms to Health Canada, and await their response, and that's how you apply for growing at home. Many people have questions about the U.S. border because, as per federal law in the U.S., cannabis is illegal, both medically and recreationally. 31 states have approved cannabis, either for medicinal or recreational, and it's likely to be legalized on a national level in the United States. However, international borders and even interstate borders are federal jurisdiction. Airspace is also a federal jurisdiction. Therefore, it is illegal in all those situations, and you should never cross those borders with cannabis. However, there was a particular concern about people who are cannabis users or work in the cannabis industry. Are they going to be banned or prevented or hassled more when they're crossing the U.S. border? And I've had many patients who said, I think I'm just going to buy unregulated cannabis or regulated cannabis on a cash-only basis because I don't want any paper record for when I'm crossing the U.S. border that I'm using cannabis. So I did a bunch of research on this and talked to actually people who work in border security, both work in border security, and so what I've been able to learn from that is this. So when we cross any international border, they always scan our passport. And what's on that scan? What do they see when they scan our passport? So the main thing they see is the stuff that we all know already. That's actually written in print on our passport. So it's our name, gender, our date of birth, location of birth, our nationality, where we got our passport, what's the expiration date, as well as anything else that our home country, so Canada, would have put on the passport. So that's so if we have a criminal history or if Canada has security concerns about it, they can load that into our passport, and that'll be available to any border guard whenever they scan our passport. But really, nothing. From what I'm going to find out, nothing else is inside that barcode, and that barcode is owned by the Canadian government. So the U.S. government or any other foreign government can't add things onto someone else's passport. They can only put things into their own system and cross-reference it with your demographics. So after they scan the passport, it'll correlate with their computers, and what they will have on their end is your identifiers, and it'll say every time it'll give them all the entry and exit data. It'll give them data if there was any denials in the past, the searches, and what were the results of those searches, and any notes entered by U.S. officials. So if you were denied entry before for a certain reason, that could be something that you maybe question about a little bit more next time you cross the border. And then the border guards will gain more information by asking questions. And there are when you're crossing international borders, there are minimal privacy laws that govern it, that govern a person's right to privacy when they're crossing it. So really, the border guards can almost ask pretty much anything, and they're not limited by any of the privacy laws, both in their country or in the person's originating country. And that's mostly because it's not considered a constitutional right in Canada or the U.S. to cross an international border. But one thing is that it's very clear in my research is that there is the U.S. both the Canadian border guards or the U.S. border guards do not have access to a citizen's health record, and that's covered by the CL laws in Canada and the HIPAA laws in the United States. So if you are a medicinal cannabis patient, it's not like they're going to have access to your doctor's notes or your pharmacy profile. They also don't have access to credit card information. This is also governed by banking acts. The most recent one in Canada was just the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act of 2004. And so this is also considered private information that is not shared readily by the persons originally in country with foreign government, even within their own country. But the border guard does nothing that prevents them from doing an internet search on Google and on social media to gain more information from the person. So if the person has a bunch of posts about cannabis or pictures of them using cannabis on social media, that would be a real strong evidence that this person was a cannabis user. They're also allowed to search anything you bring across, including the data on your phones, computers, and cameras. And so many people with sensitive information will actually, and this is sort of going to the extreme, but I know lawyers that do this, is they will wipe their computers and phones before crossing the border, store everything on a cloud and with no link to the cloud. And so if there is search, none of their sensitive client data will be accessible by border guards. So the bottom line is a border guard from any country, including the U.S., will only know if you use cannabis, if you tell them you use cannabis, or if there's evidence of cannabis use during a search, either through an internet search, search of the luggage, or vehicle content. And that could be as simple as an odor of cannabis or some residue of cannabis somewhere in someone's luggage or the vehicle. The Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, back in October when recreational cannabis became legal in Canada, advised that there are going to be, that he was informed by the U.S. Border Security that there would be no changes to the U.S. Border Questionnaire, meaning that cannabis questions will only occur unless there is evidence of cannabis use. That's different than the Canadian Border Services Agency, the CBSA, who has mandated since the legalization of cannabis in Canada, that they're going to ask all travelers about cannabis possession, and it's going to be included in all declaration forms when people arrive by air. So the Americans are sort of less. There's no protocol for the Americans to ask for cannabis. However, the Canadian side is going to be asking for cannabis possession every time. And no drug tests have ever been performed, as the research I've been able to tell, at the border. So if people are worried about drug tests, that would be something that would go down on a criminal prosecution, not on a normal entry-exit from a country. So to sort of sum it up, there's, to go back to our different cannabis users and go through the different criteria that we discussed, I thought it could be helpful to look at, to see if medicinal cannabis or recreational cannabis would be better for these people. So for the cannabis connoisseur, their needs and education is less important. So to have a physician tell them what dose and what the delivery mechanism and what any restrictions on cannabis is sort of is less important to them. They're quite knowledgeable in cannabis. They typically know what works for them, so they don't need the really educational standpoint. The supply and selection is the recreational side is probably better for the cannabis connoisseur, as if things can be sorted out on the recreational side, there can be the person would have access to any type of cannabis they want. However, if they had a medicinal prescription, they could be restricted from the physician's prescription. So assuming that there is going to be good selection and supply on the recreational side in the future, the cannabis connoisseur would probably be better off on the recreational side. On the cost side, however, medicinal is cheaper than recreational. They could get some insurance coverage. There would be a tax write-off that could be quite significant if they're using cannabis on a daily basis. There could be some better protection in their employment. They could purchase more, they could carry more, and they could grow more. And this is provided that this cannabis connoisseur is using cannabis for a medical condition. And many people are. Many people might not have gone and discussed things with their doctor. However, many people who are using cannabis on a daily basis are using it for some ailment, whether it's anxiety, whether it's helping relax, which is typically an anxiety component, sleep, or pain control. The first-time user, their needs and education is quite high, as we discussed, so the medical side would be able to give them lots of information and lots of safety on that. The supply and selection is less important to them. They're typically going to go with what is recommended to them by someone they trust. And then the cost, would be cheaper on the medical side. We don't know if this first-time user of cannabis is going to even like cannabis. And so I wrote non-applicable to the other sections, as they might use it once, they might not like the feeling it gives them, and stop using cannabis. So for most of the first-time users, what I try to do is I try to give them as much information, as much support as possible, and then I give and then I actually, if they don't want to go through the whole medical process, I give them the option to I say maybe try at a dispensary first, and I give them a specific product to try to find, just so that they can save the time and some of the nuisance that is involved with going through the medical pathway. For the medical patient, it's the name sort of implies that the medical is probably the best for them. That they get lots of education, they get a good supply and selection from medicinal products. And then they save money and have other sort of extra support even from their employment. So for a medical patient, probably medicinal cannabis is better for them. So the conclusions are there are many options for Canadians to access cannabis. There's not only one way to get the product. Each person has to evaluate their needs and make the right choice for themselves. The laws regarding medicinal cannabis use and possession and are quite and storage are quite confusing and vary per province, and so it takes for someone who wants to remain compliant with all the laws, it can be quite a large amount of research needed to get to a good level of understanding. Medical patients often, I find, like to use the cannabis clinics because they have many resources with very experienced physicians. And most doctors are interested in helping patients access cannabis, and it'll just take a time before, just before the sort of the old school medical establishment sort of comes around or is replaced by more physicians motivated to help patients with newer therapies such as medicinal cannabis. So that's the end of my segment on the webinar. I'll turn it over to you, Kelsey.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Schneider. That was a super informative presentation. We are a little bit past 8, so I do want to get to some of the questions that has come in. Just before I do that, I want to mention again, for those who missed it, that we do have 2 other webinars that are coming up in the next coming weeks. We have one on May 30th about all the evidence to date, and we have one on June 13th that will have a number of patients who have used medical cannabis for their conditions. So you can register online at cdhf.ca/events. Be sure to check those out. So we'll get to some of the questions that came in. Mark asks, the OCS says they're the only legal distributor in Ontario, but I see cannabis stores everywhere. There's one right by my house that's a CBD dispensary. How is this possible? How can you tell if a producer is licensed or not?
Oh, yeah. How can you tell if they're licensed or not? Yeah, good question. Honestly, I have a hard time telling myself. My sister lives in BC, and it's the Wild West out there. With cannabis becoming legalized, there seems to be a lot less motivation by police to prosecute the unregulated market. So it's it's very difficult to tell. I mean, I think the best thing would be just the market would just to be to ask around, maybe ask those people directly. Usually these unregulated places are quite, quite open even about what they're doing. And they would, would tell you whether they're getting their product from a licensed producer or not, and whether they were even a licensed dispensary in the first place. In Ontario, I think, I live in Manitoba, but I know that there was only a very limited amount of stores that came in Ontario. So it would be, if there was, I forget how many of it was, like 25 for the whole province, I believe, and only 5 in Toronto, which was crazy. So if there's like 2 already down your street, chances are at least one of them is an unregulated cannabis dispensary. So, and not that it's not that it's necessarily a horrible place. These unregulated places, they really spring up because of the mismanagement of the regulated industry by the government. And so, I think that a lot of people. I think throwing people in jail for cannabis is not the right approach. I think what needs to be done is the regulated market needs to compete, and offer better value to cannabis users than the unregulated market. I don't think enforcing yourself into something is the right thing, is the right approach. I think that the regulated market should become more competitive with the unregulated market.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have another question from Joanne, and she's asking, is there any news for us patients when they will omit the tax on our medicinal?
Yeah, it's something that the licensed producers are fighting hard to try to get taken out. But I think, the government, the federal and even provincial governments are all running deficits. And they really, it's really unfortunate, but they saw this whole cannabis industry as a way to make lots and lots of money off of people. And I find it particularly unfortunate that they're taxing medicinal cannabis. So it was quite shocking. And I remember when they first announced that they were going to do that, I was like, this has got to be a joke. Like, there's no way that they're going to do this. And they still did it. And they say, well, and the way they get around it is on a technicality. They say, well, it doesn't have a drug identification number from Health Canada. So by federal law, we're not allowed to tax things that have drug identification numbers, but we can tax, in terms of prescription drug identification numbers. We can't tax over-the-counter stuff. So they're saying, well, cannabis doesn't have that DIN number, so we're allowed to tax it, and so we're going to tax it until it gets the DIN number. And so somebody has to move. Somebody has to, either in Health Canada side, has to say, look, this is a prescription medication. It has to be authorized by a doctor for the medicinal cannabis. Therefore, you cannot tax it to, federal government and provincial government. But they're gonna do it as long as they can get away with it. So if there is a big uproar by the population, it might be something that they get rid of. So unfortunately, Joanne, I don't have good news for you on that one. But I'm hopeful.
Okay, great. And just a follow-up question from Joanne, is there any research that you know of that's going on, or any more research in the near future that is going to come up on this topic?
There's lots. Like, cannabis right now is one of the most actively studied substances in the world. Medicinal cannabis is becoming legalized around the world. And there's lots and lots of interest in it, and lots of physicians that are requiring more extensive studies before they're going to prescribe it. So that's something I'm actually going to talk about. If you can, Joanne, attend on May 30th. It's something I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all the evidence for and against cannabis, and sort of the research process, and sort of what sort of evidence is needed for this to become more mainstream. And so it's, and I think CDHF puts those webinars on their website afterwards. So if you can attend May 30th at 7 p.m., there'd definitely be opportunity to probably do it later on their website.
Yes, for sure. Just to mention, we will have all of the webinars on our website at cdhf.ca just in the coming weeks after they are live. So make sure you check those out. Just one last question we have from Priya, and she says, I have gastroparesis, and I've asked my doctor about giving me prescription because I've heard in gastroparesis communities that it can help, and my doctor doesn't seem receptive. Any advice?
Yeah. So we do, and one of the, like on our last webinar, one of our patients we're going to be interviewing is somebody with gastroparesis who's done very well on medicinal cannabis. So what you're saying is supported by many people in the gastroparesis community. If depending on where you live, if you do have access to a medicinal cannabis clinic, so I know in Toronto there's the Canaway clinics. There's also there's clinics across the nation called one group called National Access Cannabis, and those clinics like those, you would be able to go see a physician without a referral, and be able to get to meet with a community physician experienced in medicinal cannabis, and then they could evaluate if it was right for you and get you access to it. So there are other physicians, and if you feel this is the right thing, I don't think it's unreasonable. You went through the right steps, Priya, to talk to your regular doctor first. So I don't think it would be unreasonable to get a second opinion, especially from somebody who is experienced in cannabis therapies, and be able to talk to them about potentially trying medicinal cannabis for gastroparesis.
Perfect. Okay, so I think that's all the time that we have today. I want to thank you, Dr. Schneider, for taking the time to present this evening, and to Spectrum Therapeutics, who sponsored this webinar. And as I mentioned, they will be available on cdhf.ca. Be sure to register for the other 2 webinars in this series, and we'll see you then. So have a good evening, everyone.